Yo, what is up everybody? Welcome back to another video on the channel of Dave and Dave. Today I'm going to be talking about what you should do when landing in a Category 1 ILS approach. So, obviously when you're in a Boeing 737-800 series aircraft, you want to fly and sometimes you may be wondering how planes actually land in fog. So, today we're just going to talk about the Category 1 approach, and the Category 1 approach is useful because you will rely on your instruments until you're about 20 seconds away from touching down at the airport. When you're 20 seconds away from touching down at the airport, you are then under the clouds and it should be easier to land. So today I'm going to talk about procedures in doing so. Okay, so the first thing you've got to do is you need to understand that pilots have to go to a briefing room before every single flight they do. Now this briefing room includes things with paperwork, which would include the weather conditions, which they can get an understanding of what it's going to be like when they're landing, so they understand what the weather's like. Therefore, they can understand whether it's safe to land at an airport or they need to change their plans. With fog though, it can be safe to land at the airport with fog. So once you get on the plane, you would take off normally, and then once you are relatively near the airport, you'll be notified if you have to do a visual approach or the ILS approach. Now, when you do the ILS approach, it's a lot different from the visual approach. In a way, you have to do more planning for it. So you're going to be flying normally until you line up with the runway. So when you're flying normally, you would do your normal headings, you would do your normal autopilot, you would have your auto throttle, and you would choose what level to have that on. Now, when you have your auto throttle, the first thing you want to do with landing in an ILS approach is you want to have to do the steps of what speed you'll be flying at. So it will start off with 220 knots. When you get closer to the ground, it'll be 200, 180, 160, and 150 and 140 knots. It depends though on your weight of the aircraft. If you had a higher weight than what you usually have, it would probably be about 150. If you had a relatively low weight, it would be 140. And when you're flying the approach, what you want to do is you want to let the controller give you instructions on lining up the runway before you start the approach. What you want to do is you want to tune in your Navigator 1 or Navigator 2. They're on the left or the right side of the plane. Now, the good news about the Navigator 1 and Navigator 2 is that you can tune in on which pilot is actually flying. So, say for instance, because your captain would be on the left side of the cockpit and your first officer will be on the right side of the cockpit. Now, whoever's flying the approach is going to be the one who has to tune in the navigator. So you've got tune in nav 1, tune in nav 2. The captain would tune in nav 1 and the first officer would tune in nav 2. This is important because it depends who's the pilot flying the approach. So once you've done that, what you have to do is you have to set your course. Now, that is basically tuning in the nav 1 or nav 2. You basically have to do the course and you will get a piece of paperwork to show you about the airport that you're landing at, what course you have to be. And you would have to use the knob in the cockpit to do that. So there's a knob that has the course on it with the number. So for instance, if you're flying into an airport, you may have a course of 254 degrees. That is practically like a heading, but that is what you would use in order to land the plane ILS. That tunes in the navigator. So once you have done that, you will then line up with the runway, and once you line up with the runway, that is what you'll be heading up for landing. Once you line up the runway, you will then press the button for the localizer. So the localizer is basically the instrument that guides you into the airport. Now, you may be wondering, even though if you've lined up the runway, you've got a localizer guide you in, how would you descend to the correct altitude before landing? Well, what you would use is the glide slope. There's a button in the cockpit which is called the APP button, and what that is the glide slope. If you press it, then all you have to do is wait for the approach, and once you have got to a certain point, you will then capture the glide slope, which would mean that before you capture the glide slope, you need to be at a certain altitude. The air traffic controller will tell you that altitude, and when you are on a certain level, when the glide slope is in action, you will slowly but steadily come down to the ground at a good angle. When you come down with a good angle, it also depends on your speed as well. If your speed is too high, the glide slope will push your aircraft down more. If the speed is too low, then you would end up having to flare the aircraft more in order to maintain the current descent rate. So that's the useful thing about the ILS approach. It's basically a tool which obviously helps you land in fog, and when you are approaching the runway with the glide slope activated, your plane can move to the left or to the right, depending on have you fully aligned with the runway. The bad thing about an ILS approach is that it's incredibly sensitive. If there's one simple mistake, you're going to have to go around and you have to try the whole approach again, which is understandable because anything makes a difference in this approach. You have to have everything to be perfect. It's got to be 2 whites and 2 reds for pappy lights on the side, and you need to have 2 whites and 2 reds once you're under the clouds. So when you're flying the approach, when you're about 4 nautical miles or a bit longer, depending on your weight, you will then put the landing gear down. And when you put the landing gear down, you will have to set your flaps to the green light. So the green light is usually between flaps 30 degrees and 40 degrees. Now the flaps green light it tells you that you've got the correct flaps for landing, coordinated with your speed as well. So you've got your correct flaps there, you've got your landing gear down. Now what you need to do is put your landing lights on, as well as your runway turn-off lights on and your taxi lights on. The taxi light can be dependent. If you're landing in darkness, it has to be higher setting. If you're not landing in darkness in daytime, it will be on a lower setting. So now what you've got to do is approach the runway. Now, everyone's all seated for landing, everything's all good. What you've got to do next is when you get under the clouds, usually this will happen if you're doing a category 1 approach. Once you are under the clouds, you can then disengage the autopilot, disengage the autothrottle, and then manually land the plane yourself. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing it straight away though, because you have literally just gotten under the clouds. If you make a mistake of pitching the aircraft up too much, then you have a risk of going back into the clouds again, which can then cause a bunch of issues on your approach. So it's always important to check before you land whether to disengage or not. It's really dependent on the situation. Now, once you disengage, you will land the aircraft normally. The problem with the ILS approach is usually that you haven't got used to the controls, and in the final couple of seconds it can be quite difficult in order to understand when to flare the aircraft. And because your aircraft is probably not recognised with your hand movements, therefore it is used to the autopilot, which could mean that your landing could be less accurate than what it usually is. So you've always got to bear that in mind when landing an ILS. Now, if you have the category 3 approach, for example, that would mean that the plane automatically lands by itself using the flare function, which also automatically flares your plane. Now, obviously with the category 3, you have to disengage your autopilot when you're on the ground. Then you have to set your reverse thrust or auto brake to a certain level in order to slow down. Category 3 is only used when the fog is actually touching the ground. Category 1 and Category 2 are mainly for when the fog is really low but it's not actually touching the ground and it's safe to land without having to do it automatically. So once you go onto the clouds, you simply just land the aircraft normally. There's not a lot of issues with that. And so that's the landing for you, that's how you do it. So do a quick brief summary. So you normally fly the aircraft until you have to turn the localizer on. Once you've got the localizer on, you can then align with the runway, followed by after that pressing the glide slope button, which is the APP button in the cockpit, which will then descend your aircraft at a decent rate, which can mean that you can land safely. And then you've got to put your landing lights on, your runway turn-off lights on, and your taxi lights on. And after that, what you have to do, you need to flare the aircraft, land it. Okay, so that's the Category 1 approach done. So now you may be thinking, how do you take off in fog? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. You don't need any sort of instruments for this. You can just taxi to the runway. As long as you can see the runway, that's perfectly fine. You are okay to take off. Now, once you land up with the runway, you have a normal procedure before takeoff. Once you land up with the runway, you will see in the cockpit you have the display for your heading. So for the heading, once you're lined up with the centre line of the runway, you can look at the heading you're currently at. For instance, if you're taking off at a heading of 220, you will go down the runway as normal, keep heading 220 once you have taken off. So you go down the runway, once you reach your V1 speed, which is 140 knots usually in the Boeing 737-800, you will then rotate off the ground. Once you've rotated off the ground, the cockpit will call out a voice message saying positive rate, and then you would put the landing gear up. Once you have a positive rate, that means you are definitely flying, you're off the ground, and you're heading up with a positive rate, obviously, like it says in the name. Once you put the landing gear up, pretty straightforward from there, just maintain your heading, and also, don't put the autopilot on just yet. Always do it above the clouds, and the reason why this is important, guys, is because if there's any issues with it, then your aircraft may experience a situation where you might have a lot of issues with. So always go autopilot after you've gotten above the clouds. Once you're above the clouds, or you can even turn autopilot on when you have to turn, because then you can use your headings in order to turn the aircraft instead of, so without you having to manually do it yourself, you have the autopilot doing it for you. Yeah, after that, it's pretty straightforward, and it's pretty much the same as an ordinary flight. Now, my last thing I'll talk about in this video, guys, is the question you may be thinking in your head at the moment. You might be thinking, well, how comes I've seen flights cancelled before because of fog? Now, it's a good question actually, but you've got to understand that the ILS approach is a system that the airport actually have to purchase. It's an added extra, and it costs millions of pounds or whatever currency you have. It costs a lot of money, guys, and because it costs lots of money, not every single airport has it. That means that aircraft cannot land at that airport if there's fog. They might have to divert to another airport, and that can be a critical thing. However, there's most airports that have got the ILS approach, which is great. Some airports don't need it because the climate doesn't usually get that foggy, whereas others do need it. It tends to be the smaller airports that do not have the ILS approach, simply because they're smaller, they don't operate as many flights, therefore they're not making as much money compared to the bigger airports. The bigger airports are usually the ones, guys, who actually purchase the ILS approach. And it's important they do because many people can suffer as there's lots of flights operating from that airport. Smaller airports don't necessarily need it as much. Alright guys, I hope you all enjoyed today's video. If you have, please press the like button. And don't forget to subscribe, press the notification bell for more videos. If you liked it, please leave a comment. If you have any constructive criticism, please also leave a comment as well. I like constructive criticism as it helps me to improve in the future. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.